Thank you very much. I have been teaching natural family planning for about 14 years. I first got into it when, is this too loud? Is it? Okay. My OBGYN told me there was nobody doing an NFP in the Oshkosh area after I had my third son. You know, they come in and do the birth control talk after you have a baby. And I said, I could do that. I was recently a stay-at-home nurse, so I thought, we'll give that a shot. The rest is sort of history. I'm also gainfully employed somewhat by the Diocese of Madison. I'm the Natural Family Planning Coordinator for the diocese. And that's been an interesting adventure as well. I'm laying out some stuff down here, brochures, my business card, and some portions of what we're going to be talking about today. When you come down for sandwiches, come on down and take a look at the toys too. Some of the things that are being used. First thing I want you to notice is that the title of the talk is Living with Your Fertility Through Natural Family Planning. This, from the title, is a different concept from what we normally think of as contraception, which is more like eliminating your fertility, getting rid of it. This is living with it. We're not going to encourage couples to change their fertility or do anything to themselves that alters their fertility. Simply understand it. All right? So let's start with some basic definitions of what we're talking about. We're going to skip this one. For natural family planning, we are talking about methods of monitoring and then interpreting biological markers of fertility. Men and women both have biological markers of fertility that can be detected. For the purposes of natural family planning, we consider men to be fertile all the time. Men continuously produce sperm. Their hormone levels run pretty much steady state from puberty until death. Okay? That's kind of a basic assumption that we make. Women are cyclic. Most of us know this intuitively. This is an important component for the natural methods because we look at the changing cyclic fertility, understand the signs that tell us what the changes mean, and then use that for decision making. So we're doing the same thing that people do all the time. You're making observations, you're interpreting your data, and you're making a decision based on what you see. That's natural family planning in a nutshell. Okay, any questions? I can go home? No? Okay, well, let's talk a little bit more. There are some major methods. The calendar rhythm method is actually one that's been around for quite a while. We'll talk a little bit about that's history. It is not a natural method by the definition I just gave you because there is no observation. It's simply a calculation based on the longest and shortest cycle that a woman has ever had in the last year, and then a formula is applied to determine mathematically what the fertile phase would be. Ironically, I'll show you some stats that tell us that the rhythm method is the most commonly used form of natural family planning, believe it or not, even though there is nowhere in the world that you can go and be taught the rhythm method anymore. The closest we've come are cycle beads. Anybody heard of cycle beads? These are being produced en masse by Georgetown University. It's a little necklace. It's got 30 beads on here. You want to learn NFP in about 3 minutes? This is a cycle bead. When you start your period, a woman puts the little rubber gasket on the first bead. Every day she advances the bead by 1 a day till she gets to the glow-in-the-dark section. Glow-in-the-dark means fertility. Stop what you're doing. As she moves the beads around, she becomes infertile when she gets to the brown beads. If she gets to the dark brown bead before having a period, it tells her that her cycles are too short and that this method is not going to work well for her. So as long as she continues past the brown bead before she gets her period and does not have a period past where the red one begins, this method is 85% effective for avoiding pregnancy. Boom, you just learned NFP. And this is more technologically advanced than what most of the people who say they're using rhythm are using. It costs about $1 for the necklace. If you buy it in the US, it's $12. Big ripoff there. I got mine free at a conference. But it's a very simple model of rhythm, basically. Okay? You can teach it to large numbers of people in a very short amount of time. It's cheap. And it's actually very accepted in countries where technology is not well known. You know, these days in America, everybody's got a cell phone and a Palm Pilot. But you go to African nations and the Philippines and other countries that are not quite as technologically advanced, that's about as tricky as people want it to be. So it's actually pretty well accepted. Also, There have been problems with getting contraceptives in. You've got to walk 4 miles to the well to get the clean water to take with your birth control pill. People are not liking that very much. But this is easy. This is very easy, simple, and it works well enough. The second one is the basal body temperature method, and that was developed around the 1930s and actually popularized in the 1950s by a German physician. That involves taking your resting body temperature every day and looking for a change. And I'll show you a temperature chart as we go through. Other common ones are the cervical mucus method, also called ovulation methods. Anybody heard of Billings? Billings ovulation method is probably the most popular one in the US. Creighton model ovulation method is another one that's very popular. And they're basically looking at changes in cervical secretions that indicate fertility. Okay? Symptothermal model involves monitoring more than one sign. Basal body temperature and mucus are single indicators, single index models. Symptothermal looks at multiple indicators, and there are several popular symptothermal models out there. So those are the big 4 different types. Historically, all this got started with a couple of researchers on different parts of the world, as so often happens. Dr. Ogino in Japan and Hermann Naus in Germany both kind of simultaneously discovered that the time from ovulation to the woman's menstrual period is a relatively fixed time, about 12 to 16 days. Yeah. Sure, come on down and eat. Going to Ogino and Naus. This discovery that the woman is not fertile for her entire cycle was revolutionary. It was new. And it was believed that women were like rabbits. Anytime they had intercourse, they could conceive. It's not true. We're not like rabbits or llamas. But we, in fact, work on a cycle, a rhythm. Dr. Leo Latz popularized what he called the rhythm method with this little book in 1932. He was a physician at Loyola University in Chicago. And that, too, revolutionized family planning, because here was something that couples could do at home that did not involve barriers, which were, prior to that time, the only family planning available. So that was pretty new and exciting. The basal body temperature was first used in Germany in the 1930s. Dr. Hildebrand actually told his brother, who was a priest and had been promoting rhythm, Father Hildebrand had been finding that there were a lot of pregnancies, more than his congregation was comfortable with. So he talked to his brother, the doctor, who said, well, try putting the basal body temperature thing with it. And he came up with temperature rhythm, and is considered the first person to have done so. Temperature rhythm was different because it actually used the rise in the resting body temperature as an indicator that fertility was ending. The body temperature rises after ovulation and tells you that you're no longer fertile. Then a calendar rhythm calculation was applied to the early part of the cycle. And that, again, revolutionized it because there was something objective. Mucus-only methods and symptothermal methods developed between the 1950s and 60s. Again, in different places at different times. Sorry. Dr. Edward Keefe, you may be familiar from his use of cervical mucus and actual cervical observations. He promoted a digital exam of the cervix to identify fertile changes. Dr. Joseph Reitzer was an Austrian physician who came up with some refinements of the basal body temperature and combined that with a mucus observation. John and Evelyn Billings were an Australian physician couple who observed and researched cervical mucus changes, which had actually been observed since the 9th century. People had been seeing this, and animal husbandry people knew all about cervical mucus because you could see it dripping out of the cows when they were fertile, and they knew that that had something to do with fertility, but it really was not until the 1960s that common sense was applied to women as well. And John and Evelyn Billings came up with a system for observing changes in fertile signs that could be easily taught, understood, and systematically interpreted. They introduced that in the US as the Billings ovulation method in 1972 and have gone on to bring it all over the world, most recently mainland China in the 1990s. The major systems of NFP that you're going to see in the US now, it's kind of like the pill. You know, everybody calls it NFP or people call it the pill, but your follow-up question in the interview is which method, which pill, what are you actually using, right? You can't say the pill and know what somebody's taking. Same for NFP. There are a number of different systems. Billings ovulation method, as I mentioned. Crichton model fertility care is a more complicated Billings model, basically. They have about 20 different mucus observations that you chart. So it's very standardized, very concrete, but is essentially Billings. The couple-to-couple league and the Northwest Family Services models are symptothermal methods. They use temperature as well as cervical mucus. And Family of Americas is another Billings model, which is very popular in Latin American countries. It was one of the first models to be translated into Spanish and is widely disseminated in Central and South America. Okay? So when someone comes into your office someday and says, hi, I'm using NFP, your next question is, oh, which method? Because they may think they're using rhythm, or say they're using rhythm, but they're really using NFP. So it's important to kind of get a handle on what your client is using so you have a sense of what do they know and what data are they keeping track of and how are they using it. Technology has advanced everything from cycle beads to the ClearPlan fertility monitor, which is shown in this slide. It actually detects two things using a urine test strip, similar to a pregnancy test. You dip a stick in the urine or run it through the stream of urine once a day, and it will detect an LH surge, which tells you that you're ovulating. It also detects estrogen metabolites, which tell you that you're becoming fertile. So this machine uses two hormones to detect an on-switch, off-switch effect. On-switch is the onset of fertility, estrogen rising. Off-switch is the luteinizing hormone. Okay? The ClearPlan fertility monitor has been popular in Europe for a number of years. They actually have two models, one for achieving pregnancy, one for avoiding pregnancy. What's going on in the US right now in terms of contraception? This is data from the National Survey for Family Growth. Is that a survey you're familiar with? Chew and nod. You've heard of it. Yeah. This is a large survey that's done about every 3 to 7 years. It's actually an in-person survey of 7,000 to 10,000 people. Formerly it was women. 2002, for the first time, they also added men to the survey. This data was compiled from about 6,900 women. The data was taken in 2002 and finally put out there in December of 2004. So this is the most recent data that we have. Based on 38 million women who are current contraceptive users in the US. Majority are using the pill. Female sterilization is second. Overall sterilizations is the most common overall. You can see the numbers. Way down at the bottom of the list, you see rhythm. 1.2% of 38 million women are using rhythm. Where are they learning it, was my first thought. Who's teaching these people rhythm? Where are they getting it? I have no idea. I run across women who say they're counting days, but never who are using a rhythm method that they learned somewhere else. Observational NFP methods, such as Billings or symptothermal models, 0.4%, which is a pretty small number overall. And yet, as a percentage of 38 million, do the math. That's still quite a number of individual women. So somewhere in your lifetime as physicians, unless you're doing something like pathology, you will probably run into women who are NFP users. Maybe not often, but they'll probably come through your door at some point. Okay? They're certainly out there. How is it working? Well, as we mentioned before, there are different phases of a menstrual cycle. I'm sure that I could probably wake up any of you from a dead sleep and you could tell me everything I ever wanted to know about the anatomy and physiology of the women's menstrual cycle. Yes? Pretty familiar turf there? I've never heard of the menstrual cycle. Lift your hand. All right. We are going to skip most of that. What I would like you to know are a couple of things for NFP users that are very important. One is that ovulation occurs once each cycle. After ovulation, the hormones change and prevent further ovulation. Okay? The changes that we see before ovulation and after ovulation are caused by hormones. I'm sure that's a big shock to you as well. Okay? So we basically divide the cycle into 3 phases. Pre-ovulatory, a fertile phase, which includes ovulation and a few days after, and the post-ovulatory infertile phase, which is completely infertile, because by that time, the egg has been released and has disintegrated. The trick then is to figure out how do you tell which phase from the other. These are actually 3 consecutive Billings charts which show variability of the cycle. This is one woman. She had 3 cycles in a row. They're all different. So how can you possibly figure out anything about what days she's fertile? Well, one thing that you do is you don't look at the number of days in the cycle. Unlike cycle beads, where it's all about days, calendar rhythm was all about how long the cycle is, observational natural family planning methods are looking at the events of each particular cycle. So they are looking at changing signs of fertility, and it doesn't matter how long the cycle is. You can have a 20-day cycle this time and a 50-day cycle next time. You're still looking for events that identify fertility and infertility. Okay? Notice a couple of things on these 3 charts. One is that on the top one you see some days that are in green. Those are infertile days after menstruation. On the 29-day cycle, ovulation occurs right around day 15. That's what we would call a peak day. It's based on cervical mucus observations. After that, there are some green days afterwards that indicate the post-ovulatory fertile phase. The second cycle is shorter, and there are no green days after menstruation. And the third cycle is much longer, and there are lots of green days after menstruation. So this chart demonstrates that even though you see variability in the number of days of the cycle, the variability all occurs at the beginning of the cycle. After ovulation, each one of these cycles has 12 to 14 days of infertile days, basically, infertility. Okay? That part remains stable regardless of cycle length. Okay? And that's an important point. It's not always a mid-cycle ovulation. And that is something that you'll hear a lot. I've had couples come through trying to conceive. They were told to have intercourse from days 12 to 16. Well, they weren't ovulating until day 19. So they were missing their fertile window by several days. We looked at the charts. We said, you know, I think you're going to do better if you shift it a little bit. And lo and behold, they were able to conceive. Simply because we got the couple out of the headset that ovulation would be mid-cycle. Okay? Small but important change. What are the signs of fertility that we're looking at? We're looking at the resting body temperature, which goes up after ovulation. That's an important point. Changes in the cervical mucus. Changes in the cervix itself, which obviously has to change in order to produce the cervical mucus, and changes in female hormones, which can be detected with the fertility monitor. The hormones that we're looking at are estrogen. Estrogen is the fertility on switch, if you will, secreted by the ovarian follicle. It stimulates buildup of the endometrium and cervical mucus production. It actually will make changes in the cervix that allow the woman to see whether or not she's fertile. LH and FSH are stimulated by the pituitary. They work together to help the eggs ripen, and the luteinizing hormone is present at ovulation, thought to be the trigger of ovulation. The LH is a surge. It comes very quickly and disappears, which is why daily fertility monitoring is helpful for that. For couples who are using dipsticks, you can buy LH test kits for couples who are trying to conceive. The ones that I've met who have used them become very frustrated because it's easy to miss the surge. So using those by themselves ends up kind of being a random, shot in the bucket kind of thing. But combining them with a cervical mucus observation or even a basal body temperature observation helps them kind of pinpoint what they're looking for on their chart. It saves them a lot of money on test strips, actually. Progesterone, secreted by the corpus luteum after ovulation, stimulates receptive endometrium along with estrogen. It warms up the body temperature about 1/2 degree. Not enough that most women notice it. You don't walk around feeling hot after ovulation, but it is enough that if you're graphing daily temperatures, you can see it. It's there. Not a huge surge, but boy, on the graph it really hits you like a brick. And that the progesterone is also helpful in drying up the cervical mucus and ending the cervical secretions because it interrupts the estrogen. Estrogen is still high during the late phase of the menstrual cycle, which I think I've got, yeah. You can see on the bottom graph here, estrogen and progesterone are both high after ovulation, but the progesterone opposes the estrogen, familiar term I assume, so that the estrogen no longer produces the cervical mucus. Okay? So basically when you chart fertility signs, you're creating a blueprint of a woman's hormones. You can see where estrogen is coming in, you can see where progesterone is coming in by the changes in the mucus, and also by the changes in the temperature. Okay? Questions on that? That was like the really quick version, but I'm assuming most of that is familiar. The cervix is lined with cervical crypts, so you can see there are little indentations there that produce the cervical mucus. If you want some really fascinating, tedious reading, read Dr. Eric Odeblad, who spent his life studying cervical mucus crypts and not much else. But he has differentiated different types of mucus crypts, which secrete different types of mucus. It is very interesting what he has discovered. With the cervical mucus, the best quality cervical mucus sperm can live for 3 to 5 days within the woman's body. Sperm actually go into the mucus crypts and wait for ovulation. Without favorable mucus, sperm will die in 15 to 60 minutes. The vaginal vault is very hostile because of its acidic level. The cervical mucus makes it a little more alkaline. It gives it some sugars and proteins, which make it a more favorable place for sperm to sit and wait. Okay? These are some pictures, actual photographs of cervical mucus, and you can see at the beginning of the fertile phase, it's fairly tacky. Think glue stick. As estrogen becomes the more dominant hormone, you see that the mucus becomes more clear, more stretchy. It will actually form a thread. And at the peak fertility, the mucus becomes crystal clear, very stretchy, very slippery. Many women will describe feeling kind of wet at the vulva. And the wet sensation is also a very fertile sign. Right around this time, it's also not uncommon to have estrogen breakthrough bleeding. A couple of days of spotty bleeding, which is caused when estrogen drops shortly after peak. The most common thing that people will describe is that their mucus looks like raw egg white. And very common, very oily sensation. At the end then, as progesterone is being secreted, we see that the mucus becomes thick and tacky again. So that's kind of a basic, that's what women are looking for, those changes in their cervical fluid. I would suspect that most women in this room who will start going and looking now and see if you have it, you'll notice it. It's generally pretty obvious if you're paying attention to it. Within the ovary, there are many eggs ripening at one time. All the eggs that are going to be released are released with the same luteinizing hormone surge. Okay? After that, we'll see the corpus luteum producing the progesterone. Okay, so progesterone is a late sign. The ClearPlan fertility monitor, if you're looking for signs of fertility, gives you 3 bars, a low, high, and a peak fertility. There's a little egg on the peak fertility sign there. You just stick your dipstick in there and it reads it for you, tells you where you're at. The high fertility indicates that estrogen is being picked up in the urine. The peak fertility tells you that luteinizing hormone is being picked up in the urine. Okay? If you're looking for the beginning of the fertile phase, you're going to look for changes from dry. Sensation of moistness or wetness at the vulva, rising levels of estrogen on your monitor, changes in the cervix if you're doing a digital exam, or you can do a rhythm calculation. Find your shortest cycle in the last 12 months and subtract 19 from your cycle days. That's the math. Okay? At peak of fertility, couples are looking for clear, stretchy, slippery cervical mucus, usually combined with feelings of wetness or decidedly sogginess at the vulva. The cervix is high, open, and wet with cervical mucus. Body temperature will rise right around the peak day or day after, and you'll see the LH hormone peak on your monitor. At the end of the fertile phase, we say that the peak day of mucus, and then count 3 days after that. Urine studies have shown that ovulation can occur within 3 days, plus or minus the day of the best quality, slippery, clear, stretchy mucus. So by allowing for 3 days, we've allowed time for ovulation to take place at the end of that range and for the egg to disintegrate. Once the temperature rises, again, we count 3 days for the same reason. Peak in the LH surge, again, we wait 3 days, same reason. Progesterone level, if you're actually checking progesterone on blood levels. Or if you're doing rhythm calculations, it's the longest cycle that woman has ever had in the last 12 months, minus 10 days. Okay? So that's the official rhythm. Minus 10 days from the longest, minus 19 days from the shortest. If you ever have anyone come into your office and ask you if they're using rhythm, you ask them, how did you calculate that? That's the calculation. You can help them out. This is a standard basal body chart. This does not include the cervical mucus observation or the ClearPlan monitor observation. All of the basal, all of the multi-index methods, simple thermal models, will include both of those observations on a chart very similar to this one. You can see where the biphasic shift is. This is a very easy way to kind of pinpoint, is a woman ovulating? Is her luteal phase normal, healthy, 12 to 16 days? It is not helpful for couples who are hoping to conceive, however, simply to look for the rise in body temperature and then have intercourse. Because progesterone goes up after ovulation, the horse has left the barn. So couples really need to identify the days prior to the biphasic shift and use the days just before. The most fertile days of the cycle are going to be about the 4 to 5 days prior to the temperature rise and the first day of temperature rise. But it's hard to get that first day of temperature rise if that's all you're looking at. So we really encourage couples who are trying to conceive to check this for cervical mucus as well, so that they can find the window rather than just where the window closes. And by the time you find that high temperature, your fertile window is closing. Okay? So adding the cervical mucus to the equation helps a lot of couples figure out when the window is opening and they're becoming fertile, getting ready to ovulate. Okay? For achieving pregnancy, have intercourse during the fertile window. The observations help you figure out when it is. Go for it. If you're avoiding pregnancy, it's the opposite. Pretty simple instructions as things go, huh? How does it work? How well does it work? This is a meta-analysis of 23 ovulation method studies that have been done since about, well, it includes the WHO studies, so 1976 or 78 is included, and 15 symptothermal model studies done around the world. With perfect use, the single index or the ovulation method index, 97% effective. Typical use, more like 84%, somewhere in there. You can see for multi-index, 90 to 98%. Is that higher or lower than you thought? Mm-hmm. For avoiding pregnancy. For avoiding pregnancy. Anybody ever see the big Orthonovum book that's in most OBGYN offices? The big contraception book? It will generally list effectiveness of natural family planning, parentheses, rhythm. So they're not differentiating what models they're using. They'll talk about NFP as a mucus observation model, call it rhythm, and then say that it's 80% effective without citing any research studies. Look at the source of the information. Question?
What's the difference between perfect use and typical use?
Oh, good question. Typical use is what happens in the real world. Oh, I was supposed to take my pill every day? Nuts, I forgot. Oh, condom every time of intercourse, every active intercourse, I'm supposed to use cream with that diaphragm? Oh. Supposed to check my mucus every day? Aha, okay. Perfect use is what happens in a perfect world. Typical use is what happens in the real world. Okay, so your typical use is always going to be lower than your theoretical use. Okay? Watch out for studies and advertisements. I've seen this where they give the use figure for, or effectiveness figure for what they're advertising, and then they give the use figures for other methods with a little asterisk. And if you get your magnifying glasses out, it will tell you they're giving you typical use figures for all the ones with the asterisks. The ones they're not advertising, they'll give you typical use, and they'll give you perfect use for the one they are advertising. I've seen that in a couple of ads in women's magazines. So definitely take a look for that. Sometimes that's called imperfect use versus perfect use. They use a lot of different terms for that. So natural family planning, when used and followed correctly, can be very effective. As effective or more effective than barriers, which I think is a surprise to a lot of people. Effectiveness depends on knowing what you're doing, understanding the model, using it correctly, making accurate observations, and using it consistently, similar to any other method. What it also depends on is having cooperation and being motivated, more so than other methods. And that's both one of the benefits and the downsides, is that the couple has to work together for it. It's very difficult to use NFP on your own because it requires abstinence during the fertile time. You got to get cooperation for that. Okay? But once those factors are met, NFP can be highly effective, up to 98% effective, which is pretty good effectiveness. Some of the benefits is that it helps couples understand fertility. And I say couples because men come to classes with their wives usually or fiancés, whoever, and many times the men have no clue what is going on with the woman's fertility. They've heard of fertility, they've heard of the menstrual cycle, they've heard about being on the rag, they know about periods and tampons and things like that, but they really don't know the ins and outs of fertility. And so this gives them a new understanding about what's going on with their wife's body. It is safe and healthy, there are no side effects, it actually can promote health because women can't find out if there's something going on health-wise with their body. It gives you a blueprint of hormones. And the reproductive hormones can reflect other things going on in the body. So you can get a handle on some illnesses and diseases simply by looking at the daily chart. It also really empowers women to know their own cycles and to recognize when something is out of whack. That is a huge thing. Women become their own best advocates then for their own health care. They can go into their physician and not say, oh, I think there's something wrong with my cycles. My period's kind of off. And they go in and, here's the data, doc. And they will bring you chart after chart and say, it's been like this for the last 6 months and something is wrong. Let's figure it out. And if you know how to read an NFP chart, you can work with that person to try to figure it out in a constructive way rather than just taking pot shots or saying, oh, I guess you'll have to be on the pill then. So you can have no cycle at all. Doesn't quite make sense. It can also help to increase communication and intimacy within the couple relationship. One thing that NFP does is it gives couples a language with which they can talk about sexual and fertility issues. You can kind of have the two extremes. There's the language you use when you talk to your doctor, very clinical, very precise. There's the language you use in the locker room, very guttural and not very loving. So this gives couples a context and a language that they can use in talking about their fertility and their sexuality, which can help bring them closer together in their relationship. Couples who use NFP tend to talk about sex a lot. I think that's a good thing because they kind of know where each other is at. They talk about having children. Why are we not having a child this cycle? That becomes a question every cycle for some couples. So it gives them a context and a language that they can discuss very deeply personal stuff. And if you can talk about cervical mucus with your darling, you can talk about finances, you can talk about how you're going to raise children, you can talk about in-laws, you can talk about an awful lot of stuff that seems much less scary when you can talk about this deeply personal, physical stuff. Okay? There are high levels of satisfaction and continuation reported by NFP users. Discontinuation use of the pill after 1 year or 6 months, do you know what it is? It's about 50%. About half the women who go on it go off for one reason or another, usually for side effects. About 80% of couples who start with NFP will stick with NFP after the first year. That says something about NFP and about NFP users. It works for couples. Couples like it. It's not always easy. That same percentage, about 80 to 90%, will say that sometimes they struggle with abstinence during the fertile time, but they stick with it despite that. So it does have a very high level of satisfaction. It also promotes sharing and generosity with the couple. It also can impact moral, spiritual, and ethical decisions for couples who are pro-life, who know that there can be something that happens to that baby, embryo, blastocyst after conception, but before implantation, that can be negative. The ACOG says that pregnancy does not begin till implantation, but what happens between that? And if we flush blastocyst before that, was that a baby or not a baby? Real-life couples do struggle with that issue. Real-life physicians struggle with that issue. For those for whom that is an ethical issue, NFP bypasses it completely because it does nothing to alter a woman's fertility. Doctor does not have to worry about taking a normal, healthy, functioning body system and making it dysfunctional by prescribing the pill. Is there any other body system we do that for? Nobody ever gave me a heart pill to make myself irregular. No, my heart works, I don't fix it. But we do that with the reproductive system all the time because it's convenient. So for couples, for physicians or couples who have an ethical problem with that, NFP goes around it. It says, no, you can live with your fertility. It's healthy. It's normal. It's okay to be fertile. It's actually a good sign to be fertile when you want it. And when you don't, you can simply abstain from intercourse because you understand yourself well enough to know how to do that. And it's the only method created so far that helps couples do that. And that is a very empowering situation for couples to be living their daily lives in. Some of the disadvantages is it takes longer to learn. Some of the methods, the mucus observation methods and the basal body temperature. Basal body temperature is easy to teach. Cycle bead method, quick as a wink. Very popular for that reason. Quick to teach. The urine monitor, pretty quick to teach. Putting it all together takes a little bit more time. You're going to need more than a 15-minute office visit. Okay? Because of that, it is not widely prescribed by physicians, which makes it less accessible to couples. How many of you would know where to send a friend to get a birth control prescription? I bet everybody in the room. Where would you send that same friend to get classes in NFP? Anybody know? Some of you know, but most of you don't, because it's just not out there in the mainstream medical environment. You'd call me. That's the answer. My number's on the back of the brochures that are up front. Grab one on your way out, and you will have it at your fingertips. It's also on my business card. Mostly it's taught through church sources. So if you're squeamish about contacting a Catholic diocesan office, it's going to be hard to access NFP. But if you're willing to make that phone call, we got classes all the time. So, and we teach non-Catholics too. We teach anybody. The other tricky part of NFP is the abstinence. Couples have to avoid sperm contact with mucus contact during the fertile phase. Okay, you get the sperm with the mucus, possibility of pregnancy goes way up. Okay, not going to find support in the medical community. There was a time when I was recommended that I not conceive for a year for medical reasons. My physician went through all the appropriate medical ways of avoiding pregnancy for 1 year, and I said, I'll just stick with NFP. He said, well, I can't recommend that. I said, why not? It's worked so far. I've been using it for 19 years. Why not have me continue to use something that's worked very well? Couldn't recommend that. He probably read the page on natural family planning in the big ortho book where it says 80%, and therefore couldn't recommend it. But I went back a year later, this 1 woman year, 0 pregnancies. I'm good. And I'm not atypical. What can a physician do once you have an NFP chart? Well, a couple of things. A couple of important things. One is understanding the difference between normal and average. What is a normal body temperature? 98.6? Anybody disagree with that? A couple of hands are kind of, well, must be the wrong answer because she's asking us if we disagree. Normal body temperature? It ranges, yeah, normal ranges. You know where 98.6 came from? Yeah, college guys, high metabolism. They didn't look at cyclic women and say, what's the average body temperature for women? It's actually around 98, 98.2, but it's a range. Menstrual cycle length. What's a normal menstrual cycle length? Who said 28 days in your brain? That's how long a normal cycle is if you're on birth control pills, because that's how long they make their pill pack, 28 days. Because that is the average cycle length for women in like their 20s and 30s. But the normal range is 26 to 40 days. Anybody hear of a 40-day cycle? You're normal. Isn't that exciting? Most people who go to their doctor and say, I've got a 40-day cycle, they want to put them on the pill to make them normal 28. Okay? So having looked at lots and lots of charts, you can learn the difference between normal and average. And help to reassure your client couples that, hey, you're normal, you're okay. Not broken, don't have to fix it. And that is an important eye-opener for a lot of physicians. It also gets away from the myth that the fertile window is the same for all women. Oh, just have intercourse on days 12 to 16. It's not going to work for every woman, because every woman does not have a 28-day cycle. It will work for many women, probably about 90%, but not everyone. And if you look at the paper and actually look at the charted events, you'll see that it does make a difference. How long their cycle length is, how long their luteal phase is, how long their mucus patch lasts. All of that makes a difference in a couple's ability to conceive and have normal fertility. Ovulation spotting is another thing that we see very commonly in teenagers whose cycles are just beginning to get online, and in premenopausal women whose cycles are winding down. It's very common. It occurs from estrogen withdrawal right around the time of ovulation. I kind of showed that graph real quickly, but estrogen goes up prior to ovulation, then takes a little dip when the LH surge hits. And that dip can cause estrogen withdrawal bleeding. It's the same withdrawal bleeding that occurs when a woman takes her placebos in the pill pack. Okay, but it only lasts a couple of days. A lot of times you'll get teenage girls coming and saying, I'm having a period every 2 weeks. And you go, wow, that's really weird. You chart them out, and they're not having a period every 2 weeks. They're having a period. They're having a couple of days of ovulation spotting, followed by another period 2 weeks later. It's normal. It goes away as they mature. But a great many of those girls who are taken to their doctor for these weird periods will be put on the pill so they can have normal periods. And they get off the pill later, and they have to grow into their cycles again because their hormones have been shut down. So they still have to go through that maturation process. Putting them on the pill doesn't end that for them. Okay? It can also help you understand times in a woman's life when variations are normal. I had a woman who had a miscarriage who called me, had her first cycle, and the luteal phase was very short. And she was working with a physician to try to find out why she miscarried. He saw the short luteal phase, recognized it, knew enough about the NFP chart and what it meant to say, you have a short luteal phase. Let's do an endometrial biopsy next cycle. Call me next cycle on this day, and we'll schedule an endometrial biopsy. She was nervous about that, and she called me. And I said, is this the first cycle back from the miscarriage? Yeah. We see that all the time. The first cycle back from miscarriage or pregnancy or during breastfeeding is often signaled by a very short luteal phase. A non-normal luteal phase in a normal cycling woman, but it's a normal finding in a woman who's just delivered a baby or had a miscarriage. So my suggestion was, why don't you wait one more cycle, see what the next one brings, and do an endometrial biopsy on the following cycle if things don't normalize. Sure enough, the next cycle was right back in her normal range. And she went, whew. So knowing what is normal helps a great deal. And it's not necessarily something that you're going to find in your textbooks. I would not have known it had I not seen charts come across my desk over and over and over. It was not something that was in the nursing literature while I was in school. It simply was not out there and known. But there it was. And you talk to other NFP providers, and yeah, they see it all the time too. What else can you do? You can look at a particular client and diagnose irregular cycles, irregular cycle events. Sometimes women's hormones are not in sync. We talk about using the pill to regulate hormones. Well, what's irregular about the hormones? A chart will tell you. Most women who have irregular cycles and go on the pill have no idea what was wrong with their cycles in the beginning. They don't know if it was an estrogen problem or progesterone problem or luteinizing hormone problem. They don't know if they were ovulating or not ovulating. Fertility chart can tell you all of that very simply and cheaply. It does not cost a lot to be able to do this. Medical problems are often found initially on the NFP chart because your reproductive hormones can reflect what else is going on in your body. Thyroid problems are a huge one. Hypothyroidism is very commonly accompanied by low basal body temperatures. So you'll see women with temperatures in the 96 to 97 range, and you go, whoa, this is outside of the normal range. Normal range. Okay, and some women will just have an occasional daily dip. Okay, once or twice a cycle, it'll go down to 96.6. Okay, fine. But for a woman who constantly has temperatures in the 96 range, that's an abnormal finding. Easily picked up with a couple of cycles of basal body temperature recordings. You can also look at other cycle events because women with thyroid problems will tend to have spotty mucus. They will tend to have bleeding that doesn't correlate with the mucus, doesn't go along with the temperature changes. Their cycle's just kind of all over the place. Mucus and temperature and bleeding just don't match up in any way that makes any kind of sense. And so that you can then take the chart and say, okay, I need to look for a thyroid problem. I need to look for polycystic ovarian disease, which also has a very characteristic cycling pattern, or non-pattern, if you will. So you can begin to pinpoint your diagnostic attempts somewhere instead of just randomly shooting, oh, well, let's test this, let's test this. Let's run a whole battery of tests. Your HMO capitated system is going to love that. But you can take the chart and say, chart for me for 2 cycles, and then we'll figure out what tests are most likely going to give us the answer that we're looking for. Simplifies a great many things. You can also look for fertility problems in couples who are having trouble conceiving. Looking at the overall cycle length and pattern. Again, the cycle events. Are there problems with estrogen? You'll see that in the mucus pattern. Are there problems with progesterone? You'll see that in the temperature pattern. If you're not getting any LH surges on the urine monitor, that's an ovulation problem too. You'll see that woman's not ovulating. You'll also see woman not ovulating if there's no temperature rise. I had a friend in college whose ovaries shut down when she was 24. Started doing NFP, never had a temperature rise. Went to her doctor, said, "Hey, what's going on?" They did some diagnostics and found that her ovaries had completely shut down. She's in menopause at 24. But it was the NFP chart that gave her the first clue to that, because she was having regular bleeds. Kind of weird, but there it is. Knowing how long the cycle is and what the cycle events are can help with timing fertility tests. Most of the fertility tests that are done are based on cycle day. If you got somebody whose cycle day is not perfectly in sync with the cycle day testing algorithm, then you're going to find that the results don't match what they should. And it's not because there's necessarily a problem with the woman, it's a problem with the testing procedure. So this can help you save a bunch of money, time, and energy by focusing on what are the appropriate times for the testing and treat specific problems rather than simply bypassing the whole fertility system overall. Has anybody heard of NAPRA technology? A couple of you? That is a new type of reproductive health service provided at Creighton University. Their whole aim is to help couples who are having fertility problems have normal cycles. Our current trend in infertility treatment is to use what I call reproductive bypass. Instead of helping to create normal cycles and normal sperm counts, they simply bypass it. We'll take the sperm, we'll take the eggs, we'll put them in the petri dish, and then we'll put them back in the woman and bypass the whole reproductive process. NAPRA technology is designed to allow the woman to have cycle after cycle of normal functioning with improvement then in the odds of conceiving. So that's a whole another talk though, okay? If you wanted to find out how to get that friend to NFP classes, where are you going to find the classes? Here are a few places you can call. You can check websites for the various models of natural family planning. Creighton model, Billings ovulation method, Northwest Family Services, all the ones that I've mentioned have websites. Some of them have online courses that you can do through the mail. They can refer you to a local instructor. Most of them keep directories. The Catholic Diocesan Office, where I work, has an NFP coordinator. That would be me. There are 5 dioceses in Madison. Most states have 3 or 4. That you could call any of them, Catholic or non-Catholic, and say, hey, do you have NFP classes? Where can I tell couples to go? And they will generally be able to hook you up with something. Catholic hospitals sometimes will have that information. They may refer you to the diocesan office. Some Catholic hospitals have their own programs or have teachers who come in. Crisis pregnancy centers oftentimes will have NFP referral information and have local class information. And another good resource is the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Again, it's another Catholic organization. But there is a nurse researcher there called Dr. Richard Fehring. He's from Marquette. Actually developed the Marquette model using the ClearPlan fertility monitor. And his big area of interest is research on natural family planning and contraception. So he puts together a publication called Current Medical Research. Every 6 months, they come out with the booklet, which is now online at the USCCB website. And so you can access this for free, print it out, you can reprint it with permission, and it includes articles with comments, research reviews basically on any new research in the reproductive field that's come up since the last 6 months. There's a whole archive of these with great bibliographies. If you're doing a paper and you want some resources to go into the original sources, he gives all the original citations so that you can look them up. There's just a lot of good scientific information in these that you're probably not going to find as easily anywhere else because he puts it all together for you. You want a lit review on just about any subject, CMR will do half the work for you. Okay? So a lot of good resources out there. Does anyone have any questions? Actually, we do. I'm actually going next week. I'm going to talk to a group of 8th graders. What we do with teens is more along the lines of fertility appreciation. Hey, you're fertile. Hey, it's a cool thing. Hey, you can tell when you're fertile and infertile. You are having these changing signs. Be aware of them. And really trying to help teens take some ownership of their own fertility so that it doesn't seem like such a random thing. Diminishing fear of their own fertility. I've had 20-something women come for classes who thought they were having a yeast infection every cycle because they had this discharge. And they learned back in high school that a discharge is a sign of infection. Isn't that horrible to think that somebody does not know a normal secretion? But it's not part of the standard sex education curriculum. Nobody tells you that you have a normal fertile secretion when you're fertile. Just not there. So that's one thing that we do try to do with teens is make them aware of what normal is. We tell them that 28 days is not normal. It's average, but it's not normal. You're a teenager. You're not average either. Don't expect your cycles to be regular when the rest of your life isn't. So just allowing them to take ownership. That then can kind of pave the way later on. And some teens will then not be as interested in sexual behavior, which is kind of one of the goals, is to keep teenagers from engaging in sexual behavior because of the risks. So talking about fertility as part of the good part of their maturation process rather than it's the scary part, you could get pregnant. Taking away some of that fear is something that we do try to do with teens. Other questions? Okay, well thank you. You've been a wonderful, attentive audience. I do have all the gadgets down here if you want to come down and play with the fertility monitor. Feel free. I'll show you how it works. And try out the cycle beads.